Now, how do you do invitations nowadays? If you have something you have to invite people to, how do you do it? Do you use Facebook and miss out on all those people like my wife and I who just have refused to jump on the Facebook bandwagon? Do you send emails and miss out on all those people who just don't check emails or it goes to spam? Are you the old-fashioned way where you write cards and give them out at work or Sunday mornings whenever you find people? How do you do invitations? Kathy and I, for the last couple of years, we took this year off, for the last couple of years have always had a Christmas party that we've hosted. So that means that we're the kind of people who painstakingly handwrite all of our invitations, put them into envelopes, and then one night, in the dead of night, we go out and we stick the cards into the cracks of all of our neighbors, inviting them to come out and join us. Then, when the night of the party, this last year, came, we arranged everything in our house. We made sure the Christmas tree looked prim and proper. We had a feast of food prepared on our table. And then we sat and we waited for 7 o'clock to strike. Now, in Jesus' day, if you're somebody of importance, not like we are, but if you're somebody else of more importance, you would not be handing out your own invitations. In fact, you would have a servant, you would have a messenger, you would have somebody else who would go and deliver those for you. But I want you to catch this. When the Lord of the earth, when the King of the universe wanted to invite you into his kingdom, wanted to invite you into his family, he did not do it through Facebook or text message. He didn't even do it with pen and paper. He took on flesh and blood to bring that invitation himself in the most personal way. And this is one of the greatest mysteries of the Christian faith, because it's so hard to picture how this infinite being crammed himself into a finite body, how the genius of the universe was reduced to a human brain. But as intriguing as the how is, it's not as important as the why. And Christmas is the evidence that God decided he was no longer willing to sit back and let this world tear itself apart. Christmas is the time he appointed long ago for a divine intervention. And there are places in the Bible outside of the typical birth story that talk about this, and that's what I wanted to look at this morning. We had the Christmas story told to us by children. We had the Christmas story read earlier today. Now I want to approach it from a different perspective, mostly from Paul's understanding from a couple passages in the New Testament. And the first one that we look at is going to be Galatians 4, verses 4 to 6. Now, Galatians was a letter written to a church that was struggling with the question of, what does the law mean now that Jesus has come? And in this immediate context, Paul's explaining the difference between a servant and a son. So, follow along with me. Behind. Paul writes, when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. So this morning, you are invited into grace. I don't know what your experience as family has been up to this point, but I can guarantee you it pales in comparison to the family of God. And there's a simple reason for that. Paul said that we are heirs. If you are an heir, that means you're going to inherit something. It's the only way we use the word. So what do we inherit in this? Normally you have to wait for someone to die before you inherit. Me and my brothers remind my parents all the time of what we want in the will. I realize it's very crass and mean. My sister never partakes in it. But normally you wait for someone to pass, and then you get the benefits of the inheritance. But it's not so in this family. Because this inheritance isn't money, this inheritance isn't land, it's not family heirlooms. The inheritance we receive is grace. grace, the unmerited favor of God. This means you get something that you don't deserve. And in the context of the family of God, this means that though all of us have done harmful things to ourselves, to each other, to creation, and to God, we don't get what's coming to us. Though we are enemies of God, we were made enemies of God. We are treated as friends, but not just friends, as family. I don't need to go into detail about how we have messed up this world. Just feel free to think over the last month and you'll realize how much of a grip sin has. But grace means we don't get what is coming. It means the cycle of revenge ends now. Think about that. The cycle of revenge ends now. We are forgiven, and so we forgive others. Grace is the first language of this family. It guides our speech. It informs the way we act with each other. It means we don't hold grudges because God is holding nothing against us. As I said, this is like no family you've ever been a part of. Grace isn't optional. It's not reserved for the people that we think deserve it. And it is simultaneously the greatest relief and the heaviest burden that we can take on. Because it requires so much. So I want you to take a moment here as we're preparing ourselves for Christmas, as we're remembering the advent and the arrival of Jesus. Who is it in your life that you need to extend grace to? You have received grace upon grace from God. Who is it that you need to turn around and extend that same grace to? Grace starts with God and it flows through us. So I would encourage you to begin by asking God to give you grace for that person, that coworker, that neighbor, that family member, whoever, your spouse, whoever it ends up being. Grace starts with God and flows through us. It would be impossible to practice this level of grace if it didn't first come from God. So it starts with prayer. It starts with being centered in the Holy Spirit and allowing that to live out. But grace also needs to be paired with a different virtue that we have connected with Christmas, and that is humility. In speaking about the birth of Jesus, Paul said this to the church in Philippi. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united from Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one in mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ, Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Your second invitation this Christmas is you're invited into humility. I want you to look at this picture here. So magnificent on the big screen. This picture is called The Pillars of Creation. It was taken in 1995 by the NASA Hubble telescope. What you see before you is quite literally a star birthing galaxy. Those pillars are swirling gas, dust, the basic building blocks of stars that are being compressed to create more stars, like our sun. How crazy is that? This is where stars come from, if you didn't know. It's called the Eagle Nebula. It was called the Pillars. This picture is called Pillars of Creation because of a reference to a sermon that was preached by a British pastor named Charles Spurgeon. And so in this, he wrote concerning the birth of Christ, "And now wonder, ye angels, the infinite has become an infant. He, upon whose shoulders the universe doth hang, hangs at his mother's breast. He who created all things and bears up the pillars of creation." God, the God who created these pillars of creation, the God who is still creating stars, that God became a small, defenseless baby. Have you held a baby before? Have you realized how important it is that moment as you support their head because they can't support it themselves? How weak, how defenseless, but how so completely deserving of love that they are. There is no greater gap to overcome, to go from the creator of stars to the created baby. And a human baby, nonetheless. If anybody's been on a farm and watched calves being born, you realize they're actually very independent. They can get up, they can walk. Maybe it takes a little shaky at first. But it doesn't take them long before they are just living their life. It's not so with my niece and nephew. It's taken a long time for them just to hold their heads up, let alone eat their own food. So Christmas is the most evocative example of humility that we can find. That a king would leave his throne, not for his own gain, but purely for ours. He was not looking to his own interests when he did it, but to ours. This action of God has proven there is no condescension that is too great. There is no CEO who can't wash the floors. There is no master electrician who cannot carry his apprentice's load. Grace and humility go hand in hand because you can't have one without the other. But something has to be said. For this to work, you need to have a firm, strong understanding of who you are and whose you are. Jesus was able to give up his divinity, set it aside for his 33 years on earth to come and serve us because he knew who his Father was and he knew who he was. Far too often, we try to live with humility or with grace, and in reality, we're just letting other people use us as a doormat. We're letting other people misuse us. And the truth is, that's not humility. Humility is knowing who you are. It's knowing that you are a child of God, that you are deserving of love, and then living out of that, and then putting other people's interests alongside your own. Paul didn't say, forget about your own interests. Paul didn't say, martyr yourself for other people. Paul said, look to their interests as well. You aren't the labels that other people apply to you, and you aren't the negative thoughts that you fixate on. You are a child of God. Because you are a child of God, you can look to other people's interests as well as your own this Christmas. Now, you remember Kathy and I. We are sitting there waiting for our guests to start arriving. 7 o'clock rolls around, no doorbell. Okay. 7:15 rolls around, no doorbell. Finally, at 7:30, that long-awaited ding-dong rings through our house. So we rush down to the door, and it's our neighbor, Kristen. She was the only one who accepted our invitation to our Christmas party last year. This Christmas, God is inviting you. He's inviting you to step into the story of Christmas, He's inviting you to live with grace, to live with humility, and to spread that everywhere you go. So I say to you, step into this story by inspiring grace, by inspiring humility with your families, with your friends, with your coworkers, with the random person that you're fighting over the last turkey with. Practice grace, practice humility, and spread Jesus this Christmas season.